If you're a wrestling fan, you should really see VICELAND's Dark Side of the Ring episode 6, devoted to a legendary female wrestler named the Fabulous Moolah, whose given name was Mary Lillian Ellison. Now, what drew me in is the fact that I directed a documentary called Lady Wrestler: The Amazing Untold Story of African American Women in the Ring. So I had done some research into the history of women's wrestling, going back to the golden age of women's wrestling, which is considered the 1930s up through the 1950s is considered the golden age. And Lillian Ellison came along sort of at the tail end of that era and continued to wrestle into her 80s, into the 80s, 1980s and beyond. And so it was really fascinating to me to hear about how she broke a lot of ground, and then she had this other side of her. She was considered a bad guy inside and outside of the ring. She started out as a wrestler, became a champion, and then became a manager of other female wrestlers, as Jim Cornette, the legendary wrestling manager and historian, describes in this episode, The Dark Side of the Ring. So this episode is really a journalistic, balanced look at the life and career of the Fabulous Moolah. It has interviews with the Fabulous Moolah's daughter, Mary Austin, who of course has complimentary things to say about her mother. And it also has an interview with a wrestler named Selena Majors, who wrestled under the name Barbie, who talks about how the Fabulous Moolah broke ground for her and opened doors for her. And then it has interviews with a wrestler named Victoria Otis, who wrestled as Princess Victoria and was managed by Moolah, and Wendy Richter, another very famous, groundbreaking wrestler who had some very not so kind, to put it mildly, things to say about Moolah. But the angle that really drew me in was the part of the episode that focuses on an African-American female wrestler named Sweet Georgia Brown, whose given name was Susie Mae McCoy. Now, Susie Mae McCoy, Sweet Georgia Brown, was managed by Lillian Ellison, the Fabulous Moolah, and it has interviews with Sweet Georgia Brown's adult children, Michael McCoy and Barbara Harsey. It was really hard to watch this part of the episode about Sweet Georgia Brown because her children talk about how they feel their mother was coerced into sexual relationships that they themselves are the product of. Now, the women that I interviewed in the documentary that I made, legends like Ethel Johnson and Ramona Isbell, they talked about the racism and the sexism that they encountered, but they did not go into at all this seamy underbelly of the professional wrestling industry that is explored in this Dark Side of the Ring episode, where there were drugs and sex and that kind of thing. That was not explored in my documentary, not because I didn't find it interesting, but it simply didn't come up in conversation with the women that I interviewed. The legendary wrestlers that I interviewed more talked about their training regimen, as I said, dealing with Jim Crow segregation back in the 50s and 60s when they were in the industry. But this episode, The Dark Side of the Ring, really goes into how women wrestlers were exploited and made to do things that they really didn't want to do. In fact, Princess Victoria talks about how when she broke her neck during a wrestling match, that the Fabulous Moolah, who was managing her, basically discarded her, says, "You can't make me money anymore, so I'm through with you." And then Wendy Richter really goes no holds barred, no pun intended, in this episode, talking about how the Fabulous Moolah, quote unquote, stole a championship title from her. And what I found really interesting was that Princess Victoria talks about how if Moolah had not, in quotes, stolen this championship from Wendy Richter, that women's wrestling really would have skyrocketed, and that women wrestlers would have been taken seriously rather than gone in the direction of being looked at as just sex symbols in the ring. Now, having done a documentary that explores women's wrestling and the history of women's wrestling, I'm very skeptical of this this perspective of Princess Victoria, because I happen to think that in wrestling, as in other sports, as in all areas of life, be it business, politics, entertainment, that there is this glass ceiling that women, unfortunately, are still subjected to. It's that classic one step forward and two steps back. You know, there will be a woman who breaks a barrier or a glass ceiling, and then people think, okay, this is going to open up the floodgates where all women who come after her will be taken seriously from now on, but then society regresses right back to where we were before. So I think there's a lot of systemic sexism in not just the wrestling industry, but in society in general. I interviewed Rowdy Roddy Piper, the late Rowdy Roddy Piper, in my documentary, and he was very forthcoming about how in the wrestling industry, women are looked at as just flash, and they're not looked at as like the main attraction. And unfortunately, I think that's a mindset that still persists. But nevertheless, I would really recommend checking out this VICELAND episode, The Dark Side of the Ring, that's devoted to the fabulous Moolah. I certainly found it fascinating, and I think you will too. And I have to give a shout out to my friend Clark Ilmatical, who let me know about the episode and recommended that I watch it. And I, in turn, really recommend that you check it out. I'll put a link to it in the description under this video on YouTube. And I'll also put a link to the website for my documentary, which has not been officially released yet. It will be, I promise. I keep making that promise, but I will make good on the promise. But definitely, if you get a chance, really check out this episode, The Dark Side of the Ring, devoted to the fabulous Moolah. You'll find it really fascinating and really intriguing, especially if you're a wrestling fan.